Our next session, Cultural Sector Opportunities to Respond to the Climate Crisis. Please welcome to the stage, Director of Emilio Ambasz Institute for the Joint Study of the Built and Natural Environment and a Curator of the Museum of Modern Art's Department of Architecture and Design, Carson Chan, and Director of Real Estate and Sustainability, the Museum of Modern Art, Jean Savitsky.
Okay. Hi, Carson.
Hi, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you also to Allianz, who is MoMA's innovation and design partner, and for their support and allowing us to be here with you today. So today we're going to be talking about, we talk all the time at MoMA, but today we're going to have a conversation and share it with all of you to get deep into how we've been addressing the climate crisis and sustainability at the Museum of Modern Art. So Jean, you've been working at the museum for a while, starting as the Director of Real Estate and Development, and that transitioned and expanded your role into looking at sustainability as well. So can you tell me a little bit about how that started, how sustainability became a priority at MoMA, and yeah.
Sure. So I joined MoMA to manage the building's expansion, the museum's expansion in 2014, and the project, as everybody probably knows, ended in 2019 with the reopening of the expanded museum. And as part of that expansion, we had the support of our director and the board of trustees to pursue LEED Platinum certification for that project. And that was sort of the starting off point for the museum in terms of their commitment to doing things differently. And I know everybody uses the word sustainability, and what we're trying to do is come up with a different way to talk about it, because sustainability for us, to define it and to make it kind of less esoteric and more tangible, is let's build responsibly, let's own what we're doing, let's operate efficiently. So when we took that vernacular then and started to look at other things, Glenn Lowry, our director, at the beginning of 2020, gave us a museum-wide edict. He said, now that we've done this expansion project, the art is installed differently, we're no longer installing the art by department, we're doing it chronologically, it's a different experience for the visitors. We need to look at ourselves and how could we start to do things differently. And he said, he gave us a really, really tough task, which was reduce our waste by 50% by 2025. And in his mind, it was waste beyond just landfill waste. It was, let's look at how we are running the museum. How are we moving artwork around? How are we using energy? How are we sorting our waste, or what kind of waste? How are we dealing with our publications? What are we buying for the store? What's the supply chain like around that? How are we moving artwork? How are we framing things? How are we building exhibitions? So it was a much, much broader conversation. So we took that directive, and it aligned, frankly, with New York City's Climate Mobilization Act, Local Law 97, which was coming upon us at the same time, where we had a very aggressive goal to reduce our building emissions. And then, frankly, we had aging infrastructure. Even though we had just built this new expansion, we tied back to a physical plant that had been put online in 2004. So there was a confluence of kind of three really major areas. So we started going down the road of what does this mean for us, and then COVID hit. Brakes went on, everything kind of stopped. But we took that opportunity to say, okay, everybody is not working, operations across the world have kind of shut down. Let's do some research. So we started to make some phone calls. Everybody was home, nobody was in the office, but we were tracking people down, and collectively we met with about 50 different institutions globally, whether they were museums or cultural institutions or cities or NGOs, people that were doing, or groups that were doing things right, that we felt were doing things right. And everybody, I mean, you probably talked to people in this audience, everybody was so generous with connecting us to other people. So as the world was reopening from COVID, we at that point kind of were able to develop a three-pronged strategy around what would this mean for us to do things differently. So we looked at it from three different areas: energy, waste, and we called people. So we knew we needed to reduce our energy by about 27% in our emissions to comply with local law 97 requirements. We had this goal from Glenn to reduce our physical waste, which meant doing waste audits and understanding kind of what we had to do. And then we also realized that everything that we did needed to support the business mission and basically be able to engage our visitors as well. And one of the things that we learned through all these conversations was the big needle movers around all of these things were going to be things that people, for the most part, didn't really care about and couldn't engage with, like optimizing our chiller plant. Well, for me, that's exciting, but for others, it's not going to be. So how do you put in the big infrastructure movers, the things that are going to make a difference, but then also run a parallel path where you can engage the visitors, you can engage our colleagues, that's, and everybody feels a part of what we're trying to accomplish. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of the beginning of our journey. Mm-hmm. Great. And then if I can continue on just for a few more minutes, I think it's important because myself and my two colleagues that were engaged in this, we have a huge department of 3 doing all the sustainability work, and then obviously Carson's our other partner. We were project managers from the expansion project, so everything we did was data-driven, because you can't, and I've heard this now, I was here since this morning, and I've heard this multiple times, you can't manage what you don't measure. So we knew we had to understand where are we using energy, which systems are most energy intensive, where is our waste, what is our waste, what makes up our waste stream. So we went in and did a deep dive to understand where the opportunities were. And when we looked at our infrastructure, we didn't look at the design specifications. We went in and actually measured and monitored each piece of equipment, gave it a letter grade, understood, if it was an A or an F, and if it was an F, why was it an F, and where were the opportunities to start to, look at how we're operating our equipment. The other thing that we did that helped us really understand our baseline is we got our arms around our carbon footprint. And that was scope 1 and scope 2, but then scope 3 as well. Mm-hmm. And in a museum, scope 3 is very interesting because when we looked at our overall carbon footprint, the major driver of it were our visitors coming to the museum and products we sold in our stores. And those are the 2 big revenue sources for MoMA. So we definitely don't want to stop those. We don't want to cut that out. So we said, okay, if we pull those 2 pieces out of the equation and rerun our carbon footprint to those things that are under our control, where are there opportunities? So we had that, we understand where we are, we own our carbon footprint, and now we're going to start to, we've been on a journey for the last 5 years to figure out how we're going to be reducing things. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I'm just going to mention is that myself and my 2 colleagues, we can ask the questions, we can open the doors, we can provide data, baseline information, but really the change comes from within the organization. So we have a sustainability task force, which is made up of not necessarily people that are interested in sustainability, but they're decision makers and senior level people in the different departments. Those are the ones that can affect change. Mm-hmm. So we're guiding them in the conversations to look into their own operations to see where there are opportunities to do things differently.
Great.
So that's kind of where we are now. And it's been a 5-year journey, and we're going to continue on. Yeah. But I think, Carson, since you and I work so closely together, I think it would be great if you could talk about the genesis of the Ambasz Institute for the Built and Natural Environment at MoMA and what the mission is and how we work together.
Yeah. So the Ambasz Institute started in 2001, mm-hmm. 2021. And I guess so this is our 4th year in operation. And what's been really interesting is to see sort of, even within the time that I've been doing this job, the mission has been changing, A lot has changed in how we think about sustainability and how the museum thinks about sustainability. So that's been really exciting. It started as an idea by Emilio Ambasz, mm-hmm. who was a former curator at MoMA in the 60s and 70s. And after he left the museum, he became an architect and one of the leading voices of green architecture in the 80s and 90s. And through a generous gift from Emilio, this institute was started in the architecture and design department, in which I became the first director of this institute. And in a way, it's been a kind of long time coming that such an institute is there and is necessary. Architecture, MoMA is one of the first museums to have an architecture and design department in the 30s. And the way that the museum has been showing architecture has been looking at architecture as objects. And in many ways, this is only a very small kind of part of the story of architecture. Architecture in the built environment produces about 39% of the world's greenhouse gases. So the built environment includes roads and a lot of infrastructure. So when we think about the built environment, we can't look at just pretty buildings. And so part of what I want to address is to address the rest of that. How do we change the way we think about the built environment? And so that requires a kind of redefinition of what architecture is. When we think about architecture as object, we think about architecture as buildings. But architecture is, in fact, a process, and that's sort of what I want to do with the Ambasz Institute. So architecture is resource extraction. Where do the materials come from for making buildings? It's about the labor connected to that extraction. It's about the social, economic, racial, context of buildings, and it's about the afterlife of buildings. What happens when we're done with them? Do we dismantle them for parts? Do we demolish them and bury them underground? So that whole thing is architecture, and the building is just one part of that process. And so by redefining architecture in that way, we can address a lot more other questions, including the climate crisis. And so through a number of different initiatives, including work with students, lecture series, discussion series, doing YouTube videos, publications, and of course exhibitions, which you've seen on the screen. Emerging Ecologies was our first exhibition. And that aimed to show how architecture in the US responded to the rise of environmentalism in the 60s and 70s. In a way, starting the Ambasz Institute with an exhibition, with a historic exhibition, to say that, in fact, many of the issues that we have now, thinking about climate and environment, people have thought about many decades ago. So the solutions are there. The solutions have been thought about. And so this is a kind of reminder that, in fact, we're not starting from scratch, that there's a base in which we're working from.
I took that away from that exhibition immediately. When I first time I went through it, I thought this is exactly where we are now, and the challenges are the same.
So great to hear.
Yeah.
But challenges, I want to ask about challenges. What are some of the major challenges in some of the things that you said you're doing at the museum? Trying to enact change, is great to say, but there are obstacles all the time. Money is a big one. You have no challenges.
We've had no challenges. It's been really easy, no problem. Everything's been done. And one day that will be true, but it's not true right now. So I think the biggest, one of the challenges, and there's been a whole kind of range of them, I guess, but when I joined MoMA 10 years ago, one of the things that struck me about working in a museum is that the environment, the physical environment, and the environmental controls are like being in a hospital. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with very, very, very specific temperature and humidity ranges that cannot deviate. You never shut the museum off, you never shut the air conditioning systems down. Even if the museum is closed, which we never close, you still have to maintain the art, because that is what is within those walls. So the strain on the systems and the ability to reduce energy and run a museum more efficiently while you're dealing with conservation issues, while you're dealing with a range of different types of art, different types of materials, all in this environment, with energy costs going up. And we've got a procurement strategy where we've bought energy into the future to hedge against these rising energy prices, but also in a strategy which allows us to reduce our energy use. But that was one of the big challenges, is how do you maintain this environment while reducing emissions? And also, frankly, you have people coming in and out throughout the course of the day. On a rainy day, it gets really humid and really warm in the museum, and yet you still got to maintain the same temperature to protect the art. Behavioral changes, like you mentioned, changing the way people think about things. Everybody wants to everybody's concerned about the climate. People want to make a change, but when they actually have to do it, it's different. And it's almost like an organizational development strategy that takes a long time because people have been doing things in a certain way for years and years and years, and nobody is going to change overnight. So I think that's something that's going to be an ongoing challenge that we're working through, and it's a lot about communication and it's a lot about engagement. I think another challenge around this is, for us, it's getting the funding for the projects, because we're competing with a lot of different baseline business units that basically are the museum. So how do we compete for money for new equipment and new infrastructure? So we've been going out into the market and trying to find opportunities, and there has been opportunities for financing, whether it's through Con Edison or through NYSERDA, through grants. The Frankenthaler Climate Initiative has been incredibly generous and supportive of our work. So we're trying to get our own funds, and the IRA now is open to cultural institutions, and we're starting to pursue that. So because we know this is essential to do it, but we also know that keeping the museum going and continuing to grow the collection and being able to have programs like yours is just as important. And I think the final piece is doing the work that we're doing in an environment where cultural organizations are often criticized for not doing enough. And that's a challenge, because we are doing things and we're trying to socialize what we're doing, but it really is, it's a lot of catch up that we acknowledge that we have to do. So I think, kind of segueing from that question, Carson, is, you work closely with artists and the, other cultural institutions, and how have you seen the climate crisis change the way artists think or approach their work over the last 4 years?
I mean, I think without a doubt, for everyone I'm talking to, artists, architects, scholars, it's the prime question that people are thinking about. So just like how the internet, let's say, 20 years ago, changed the way a lot of artists were thinking, even though they weren't working on internet type topics, similarly, climate is affecting every aspect of art making today. And as I said, in the last 4 years of operating, I've seen change happen. And what I realize is that, at a museum, we don't write policy, so we can't make changes in terms of how people, to mandate how people behave. But I think we can change the context in which people are asking questions, in which people are thinking. And maybe it's a longer term kind of change. Maybe it's a long-term change, a time that we don't have. But I think about, one thing that we want to do is work with children. So even though the Ambasz Institute is a research institute, very early on I realized that, maybe my audience is not only the 60-year-olds, but it's the 6-year-olds. It's the people that will be making policy in the future. And so if you think about, let's say we develop a children's book about the circular economy, and within the book we never use the word trash, but everything that is not used becomes raw material for something else. So then the concept of trash, of garbage, is just not even part of their thinking anymore. So I can imagine in a generation or two, then they'll see how ridiculous it is that we use things for 5 minutes and then bury them underground for 500 years. And so it's that kind of change that I think it can be more permanent, and something that we can do at a museum that perhaps other kind of cultural institutions or other kind of governmental institutions can't do as easily. But on a kind of very pragmatic scale, we've been advocating for architecture schools to address the climate crisis. So once a year we do something called Architecture Studio in the Anthropocene, in which we invite every single architecture school in the US and Canada, and we impress upon them over at a summit why it's imperative that we train architects of the next generation to have climate literacy, ecological literacy, environmental literacy, so that we don't continue to make the mistakes, so we can bring that 39% greenhouse gas number down. Yeah.
And that's where the impact happens, when it's you start young and you're thinking differently from the very beginning, so you don't end up in a situation like many of us are in now, is trying to change the way people have been thinking for 50 or 60 years and to do it differently. Because one of the other things that we've been doing too, which I think is interesting, we've been working closely with you and other institutions. There's a coalition of museums in New York City now, and we all work together, because to make change and to do things differently requires all of us to be aligned in how we're doing it. So whether it's a conservation type situation, or how we create art, or sharing crates, or moving things to the airport together, anything that we can do, how we engage with our visitors, what kind of programs are we offering, but to do it together. So we are, it just makes it a more united and committed endeavor.
Exactly. So as we're working, within MoMA, this coalition, that you're talking about, is with all, a number of New York institutions. So this knowledge sharing, is going to be a huge aspect of, I think, what we do going into the future.
Yeah. More to come.
Thank you.